So welcome everybody to season 3 of Citing Vulnerability, the lecture series being hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. We have had excellent feedback on the first 2 rounds of this particular series. We have had the dominance of some themes such as climate change and disaster as part of the focus areas. We're hoping to move forward with some new directions. So while Deirdre kicks off the series this time with climate change and literature as the lens, we also have a geo-humanities specialist, Eric McGrain, speaking later. We have a one more person, but a comparativist from Thailand. And we have a life science specialist who practices and experiments in and writes about education, green literature, and life sciences, lined up for the series this time. I'm delighted to see all of you here. The chairs, lectures, and events get very good responses. And that's principally because our speakers have been very generous with their time and are more than happy, date and time permitting, to participate in this series of talks. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Deirdre Byrne from the University of South Africa, who, to ensure that she got in on time, logged in 10 minutes ahead of schedule to make sure. And we can understand the confusion that usually happens with different time zones, a new and odd way of dealing with the cosmopolitan world we live in. So welcome to all of you. I must apologize on behalf of my colleague and friend, Professor Anna Kurian, Faculty Fellow, UNESCO Chair. She's traveling and cannot be present today, but she will, of course, be watching the recording. For those of you who are new, you know that the recordings of these talks provided by specialists are placed online at the chair website after the talks are done. So early December, you can expect the talks to go online. And now I'll hand everyone over to Atul Nair, project fellow, project assistant with the UNESCO Chair and a PhD candidate. And welcome again, particularly to you, Deirdre. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
If I may formally introduce you, Professor Byrne, to the audience. Deirdre Byrne currently works at the Institute of Gender Studies, University of South Africa. She does research in social theory, media studies, English literature, and gendered social practices. Her current research projects are ZAP, or ZAPP, the South African Poetry Project, and Gender and Love. She has contributed to the Routledge Handbook of Ecofeminism and Literature, and her work has appeared in journals such as the PMLA and the English Academy Review. Today, her talk is titled Climate Change Vulnerability in Africa, the Lens of Literature. Welcoming you once again, and over to you, Professor Byrne.
Thank you so much. Before I even actually start, I want to thank Professor Pramod K. Nair, Professor Anna Kurian, and the whole team at the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad for having invited me to address you. It really is a great honor to be in such distinguished company and to share my ideas with you. Now, the first off, I'd like to say the title of the lecture series really intrigued me. What do we mean by citing vulnerability? What could the UNESCO Chair have meant? To me, citing implies identifying locations where a phenomenon can be observed. If we're identifying places where vulnerability is particularly vividly felt, we can't ignore the global south, and I would argue we can't ignore Africa. I know it's a great oversimplification to regard Africa as the global capital of poverty, and that we are all more than tired of the image of a poor African with their hand out asking for food, which is in fact somewhat of a stereotype and only serves to reinforce African dependency on the global north. However, it is true that more people in Africa live in extreme poverty than in any other region in the world. So, for example, a 2022 report found that 54.1% of people living in Central Africa are living below the poverty line, which is a shocking statistic. If we consider the poverty line is considered to be, you have something like $1.60 US cents a day to live on. Secondly, in my own country, South Africa has the world's highest Gini coefficient for inequality of income in the world. And finally, Africa is filled with low levels of education. I can expand on this, but for now, you could just take my word for it. And these low levels of education continue to perpetuate the cycle of poverty to the point where poor education is itself considered to be a marker of poverty. Living in conditions of extreme poverty, which goes along with lack of access to financial and educational resources, obviously drastically reduces people's ability to ensure their own well-being in the face of disaster. Under climate change, many Africans, especially those who rely on the land to provide food and water for themselves and their families, have lost livelihoods, have lost food and water security, and are struggling to stay alive. The situation is considerably compounded by the fact that once these poor people do lose their livelihoods, then they become unemployed and national economies suffer from high unemployment rates, as is the case in my own country. Now, the situation is further compounded by the fact that the global north has a long history of extracting resources from Africa. Some of these have been minerals, so again, to refer to South Africa, gold, chrome, platinum, diamonds, and then, of course, labor. And we're all familiar with the global North's tradition of using African people as slave laborers. And recently, a sinister turn of events has seen the global North using the global South to extract energy resources. So, for example, sorry, I just got a message from somebody saying, do I want to start my slideshow? Don't know can you not see a slideshow, colleagues?
We can't see we can now see the slides changing, yes.
I'm so sorry. I thought it was I thought I was showing my slideshow. Do apologize. I'll just pick up from where I am then. So, for example, British fossil fuel company Shell had plans to frack for gas off the Western Cape Coast. This is a move that would have completely devastated and probably completely traumatized the region's extensive marine life. And fortunately, it was stopped by means of local activism. And secondly, I mean, these are just two examples. Recon Africa has, it's a Canadian company that has plans to extract oil and gas from the Kavango Delta in Botswana and Namibia. Now, all of these practices are damaging to the environment in different ways. First of all, they destroy the habitat of many different species. They cause species loss, and they deepen the injustice and inequality between the global South and the global North. In essence, they actually increase the global South's dependency on the global North. Now, this situation has drawn considerable attention from African artists who I would like to showcase here because they're quite unknown and yet, in my mind, deserve to be better known. So I've chosen 4 texts, having said in the abstract that I will be discussing 3, I've actually chosen 4. The first one is a documentary film. It's called Temperature Rising. It was produced by the South African film company Uhuru Productions, and it dates from 2024. And Uhuru means freedom. Then I have 2 novels. It Doesn't Have to Be This Way by Alistair McKay, dating back to 2020, and Nnedi Okorafor's novel Noah, dating back to 2021. And then 1 short story entitled The Water Harvesters by Rugore Nyamhunga, published in 2024. I've just chosen these, as it were, almost at random, because just to take one African author, many of Okorafor's novels do depict climate change and vulnerabilities, and particularly desertification, the desertification of Central Africa and her own region, which is West Africa. So there are many others that could have been mentioned. And it's important for us to know that African artists are paying attention to climate change and are also becoming very aware of the importance for climate justice. But I'm first going to talk about the texts and my own approach to them, and then I'm going to draw some comparisons and see what we can take away from the different texts. Okay, so looking at, I think it's quite important for me to tell you that I regard vulnerability, which is the title of my talk. Vulnerability has a lot to do with intersectionality. It arises, I'm only going to give a very small dose of vulnerability theory because I'm very aware of the fact that I'm in the presence of the UNESCO Chair of Vulnerability Studies, and that no doubt most of you know more about vulnerability than I do. So, but just to give my angle on it, which is that vulnerability arises in intersectional ways. And we're all familiar with the theory of intersectionality, which was invented and introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And what Crenshaw's intersectionality and subsequent versions of intersectionality have shown us is that axes of oppression or discrimination intersect and interact, and vulnerability does the same. It intersects and interacts with other axes of oppression and discrimination, including race, class, gender, disability, ethnicity, and so on. So for this reason, I want to emphasize that I prefer to speak about vulnerabilities rather than vulnerability, because as I'll show when we look at the literature, vulnerability is differentially experienced and differentially constituted. So I'll start off with the documentary Temperature Rising, made by Uhuru Productions. And Temperature Rising follows the life and fortunes of the three African climate activists whose faces you can see on the poster for the film. Starting from the right, the first climate activist is Ina-Marie Shikongo. So Ina-Marie Shikongo is a Botswanan climate activist, and she comes from Botswana's Okavango Delta. The Okavango Delta is a World Heritage Site, which is home to 1,000 plant species, 89 fish species, 64 reptile species, 482 bird species, and 130 mammal species, as well as several indigenous communities who are living on the shores or around the river as it winds through the delta and depend on the river for their lives and livelihoods. Shikongo noticed how the Canadian firm Recon Africa had proposed to begin fracking in the Okavango Delta. Fracking is a process that involves pumping enormous quantities of water at very high pressure down a pipe and under the ground in order to release gas. and it causes irreversible damage to the environment. Chikongo realized that this would essentially would only benefit Recon Africa. And I'd like to invite all the attendees to go to Recon Africa's website and see how they promise to engage with environment and social groups, and yet Chikongo tells a completely different story. And she observed how Recon Africa had caused habitat destruction simply by setting up to conduct fracking exercises, and how it had negatively impacted the lives and livelihoods of indigenous communities in the Delta. And this is how she ended up at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP, in 2022. And I believe that to date, Recon Africa's activities in the Okavango Delta have actually been halted, partly as a result of Chikongo's work, but also of others who have been involved in protesting. The second climate change activist is Gabriel Claassen. Gabriel Claassen is the youth coordinator of Africa Climate Alliance, and he has been realizing that South Africa's dependency on coal, because coal provides most of the energy in the country. Our energy company is called Eskom, and it relies heavily on coal. Claassen realized that our dependency on coal is not sustainable, and he has been campaigning tirelessly and for many years against our dependency on coal. But he's run into great opposition and resistance from powerful financial interests in the government. And if anybody is here from South Africa, you'll know exactly who I'm speaking about. There are certain government ministers who derive significant profit from the sale of coal, and are obviously not very keen to relinquish those profits. The third activist in temperature rising is Kumi Naidoo, who is I think he was Durban-based, and he focuses on the devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal 2022. So what had actually happened in 2022 is that a total of 300 millimeters of rain fell in 24 hours and caused enormous damage, such as what is shown in the picture here. And Naidoo notes that 459 people were killed by the floods, 4,000 homes were destroyed, and devastating 45,000 people were made homeless by the floods. And since that time, we've been listening to the KwaZulu-Natal provincial government saying that they will attend to fixing the damage and they will attend to the homelessness of people and do repairs. And we've yet to actually see any kind of wide-ranging repair scheme being implemented. And Naidoo reports on this in Temperature Rising. So overall, the film really confirms that the impact of climate change is most catastrophic amongst poor people who in different ways are living at the edge of survival to start with. The film's most shocking revelation is the terrible indifference of powers in the global north to the global south's pleas for a just energy transition. All three of the activists attended the COP and were not listened to in any way at all. So I'll now move on to my second text, which is It Doesn't Have to Be This Way by Alistair McKay. This is and I would want to say that whilst Temperature Rising is a documentary and so it deals with what we could think of as real conditions, the other three texts I'm going to be exploring here are all in the genre of speculative fiction. And although people frequently think that speculative fiction is an escapist genre, I firmly believe that this is not the case. And I firmly believe that as climate change calls on us to imagine alternative futures, either dystopian or more egalitarian, speculative fiction is perfectly suited to this particular end. It doesn't have to be this way refers to the climate, one of its main characters, whose name is Lutando. Lutando, I think, is featured on the cover here. And Lutando is a climate change activist, and it doesn't have to be this way is his slogan. And the novel calls upon the reader to make choices, make responsible choices in their interactions with the environment to prevent it, in other words, the climate, from collapsing in the way in which it does in the novel. It doesn't have to be this way is bookended by a dystopic vision of climate change, where the only times of the day when one can actually live are early morning and night, because the temperatures soar to unlivable heights during the day. Inhabitants are reduced to bartering their own excrement for what is called fly food. Fly food is made of dried fly maggots ground into powder and for their high protein content. And the first thing that the first narrator recalls is that he went with his father to the fly farm with a milk bottle filled with their family's excrement and traded it for a little bottle of protein powder. Only later in the text do we realize that South Africa's most beautiful city, which is Cape Town, has been hit by floods caused by rising ocean temperatures and the melting of global ice caps. Along with this, the temperature on land has risen catastrophically, so that a person who goes outside during what they call the stillness hours, when the sun is shining, will die because their organs will stop functioning. The child narrator Milo explains, "The important thing is to keep my heart slow and steady. Holding my breath makes it race. Thinking too much makes it race. And we can't afford to let our hearts race," he says, which is Milo's dad, Lutando. "Not when the sun is overhead, unstoppable." He calls this time of day the stillness hours. If we move too much or let our hearts race, the temperature rises in our bodies and the air can't cool us and our organs fail. So in this novel, climate has become literally the enemy of human life and will actually kill people unless they resort to very, very careful care of their movements, their bodies, and their vital organs. In addition, there is a dramatic lack of water and concomitant lack of food as well. I only noticed when I reread the novel for the third time that Milo also says that his house, where he lives with his parents in a little corrugated iron shack, is half a block away from the rising sea levels, which will certainly eventually flood it. So it's an extreme climate dystopia. The novel presents numerous types of vulnerable groups with differential vulnerabilities. Black people in the novel are seen to possess vulnerability because of their historical inequality with white people. Then there are Black gay men. The two of the main protagonists, Lutando and Viwe, are two Black gay men who are vulnerable because of their non-normative, or what Kopana Ratele calls non-traditional sexual orientations. And then there are white gay men who are similarly vulnerable because of their non-traditional sexual orientations, but in a different way from black gay men. And then there are poor people and they're all differentially affected by the climate disaster, but none of them is unaffected and none of them is unharmed either. So of the two Black gay men protagonists, Lutando and Viwe falls prey to Black society's discrimination and oppression of non-normative sexualities. And I will not ruin your reading of the book by telling you what happens to him. Lutando also falls prey to the same form of discrimination and prejudice, but in a different way. He lands up having sex with Viwe's ex-wife, and they have a child. So by the end of the novel, he's effectively abandoned his own sexual identity. After the climate disaster, the rich people retreat behind something called the wall, which is an actual genuine wall, to a place called the Citadel, which is higher ground in Cape Town, where their money can buy them virtual reality, thanks to implants in their brains. And the virtual reality, in turn, can anesthetize them against their understanding of the horror that is going on around them. Air conditioning is available in the Citadel, and so is any kind of food that the inhabitants choose to order. And the Citadel even has water. Now, every so often, a rich person realizes that their comfort inside the Citadel has been bought at the expense of the immiseration of the poor people on the other side of the wall, and then they leave. This is something that reminds us, or reminds me, of Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, in which, similarly, a perfectly happy person will walk away from a city that is where everything is happy because the happiness and prosperity of the city is dependent on the continued immiseration of a single child. So these are the same. This is the same kind of choice. If one chooses to leave the Citadel, first of all, one can never come back. But it means that the implant in the brain that connects to virtual reality is going to be removed. Then the person, who is now called a believer, will have to adjust gradually to reality, to the reality of irreversible climate change and their own vulnerabilities. McKay's novel follows one believer, the white gay man called Malcolm, who is too white and too nervous to join in Lutando's fight against climate change. Malcolm is not in a higher class than Lutando and Viweb. He also belongs to the middle class. And the fact that he chose not to join in with Lutando's climate activism demonstrates white fragility as well as its culpability for never not intervening in the country's fortunes. By featuring these different groups of intersectionally vulnerable individuals, it doesn't have to be this way, shows how climate disaster impacts differentially on the rich and the poor, and calls for an effective end to injustice, lest we land up in what McKay sees as an irreversible dystopia. Now, my second novel is Nadia Okorafor's 2021 novel, Noah, and I have it down as vintage Okorafor. I think it fits into a lot of the ways in which she frequently writes. It features a young woman protagonist who is badly disadvantaged and challenged, but manages to overcome her challenges and becomes a hero in the end. Secondly, it features biotechnological enhancements. This is something that we find quite often in Okorafor's. It also features a struggle between the good guys and the bad guys, and it also adds in a climate change theme, which of course is of great interest to me here. The young girl's name is Anwuli Okudili, also known as AO. AO for her stands not for her full name, but for autobionic organism. She experiences intersectional vulnerability because she's disabled. She was born with withered limbs and disfigured internal organs. And then she was injured in a vehicle accident when she was 14. She has been prosthetically enhanced then, despite the advice of her parents and various other people. So she insisted on going ahead with the prosthetic enhancements. She has extendable metal legs, a cybernetic left arm, and a neural implant for pain management. And this is when she adopted the moniker AO, or autobionic organism. The biotechnological enhancements add to her vulnerability because her community now fears that she is not fully human. So she's not at home, and because the community has numerous Luddites or anti-technological people who don't believe that she is that she is a human, and especially not that she is a woman. But the reader, I'm sure, will recognize echoes of Donna Haraway's cyborg in AO's representation. Haraway's cyborg is inextricably liminal. It is neither fully male nor fully female, neither fully organic nor fully machine, and is irreverently unfaithful to any stories of origin of any description. AO fits into this description very neatly. She knows that her parents, who were aware of her disabilities when she was in the womb, wanted her to die even before she was born. And she's not welcome amongst her community. When she's vilified by a group of people who dislike robots and technology, asking her this question, what kind of a woman are you? She kills them using her cybernetic left arm and is forced to flee. Then she meets a man called DNA, Dangote Nuhu Adamu, who has also committed murder in self-defense. And they set off in search of safety. And they found themselves in a place called the Red Eye. The Red Eye is a vast sandstorm that rages perpetually in the northern regions of Nigeria. And I have, this is my not particularly imaginative representation of what the red eye might look like. The red eye is a symptom of climate change, including desertification and the failure of the water table. It can be read as a symptom of Africa's water woes to come. People who live in the red eye have to use machines called anti-aging machines to protect themselves from the omnipresent sand and dust whenever they go outside. Yet it is also a source of energy, which giant wind turbines called Noahs harvest to power the distant cities. In this way, Okorafor depicts how climate change can be very powerfully ambivalent. The storm causes immense damage and is also an indicator of that damage, but it can be used as a source of energy. In a further twist, the Noahs are owned by something called Ultimate Corp, which controls all of the resources and uses of energy in Nigeria. Ultimate Corp is Okorafor's version of all the capitalist multinational corporations in our world, which apparently care for nothing but profit. AO's experience in the red eye enables her to communicate telepathically with a vast network of artificial intelligence, which she calls the pomegranate. This is achieved at considerable cost to her own health. And this newfound ability makes her a highly desirable asset for Ultimate Corp and leads to the novel's ultimate showdown. Similarly to It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, Noah depicts vulnerability as intersectional and ambiguous. AO's technological enhancements give her enormous power and communicative abilities, but they also make her a freak in her anti-technological society and cause people to doubt whether she is a woman or indeed a human. Similarly, the environmental degradation that has led to the formation of the red eye also leads to technological advances, such as wireless energy transfer between cities. In other words, the novel presents a very sophisticated and highly nuanced picture of climate change, along with, of course, with the kinds of things that you expect from Nnedi Okorafor, the huge showdown and a lot of other things. Okay, moving on to my final text. It's The Water Harvesters by Rugare Nyamhunga. It was written this year in 2024, and it can be read. The whole short story can be read at this website here. The story depicts a near-future Zimbabwe in which the country's fabled fertility has been destroyed by desertification. Prior to President Robert Mugabe's land reform program, Zimbabwe was a significant supplier of wheat and maize to other countries in Africa, although there's quite a lot of doubt as to whether it was really the breadbasket of Africa, as it used to pride itself in being. And Nyamunga's protagonist, whose name is Hope, thinks back on the country's misfortune, and she says, Zimbabwe used to have a temperate climate. The green and blue scenery in the village elders' photographs astonished me as a child. However, fossil fuel consumption increased, as did pollution. Then, Earth was superheated into the slab of brown chalk before us. Soon after, the entire ecosystem unraveled. Only the elders remembered the days before most animal and plant species died out. Hope, the two protagonists in the short story are Hope. Hope is a common name for women in Zimbabwe, and Tapiwa. Tapiwa translates to, we have been given in Shona. And they are rogue water harvesters. They collect water and distribute it in an equitable manner. In this way, they fall foul of a corporation called Water Corp. And Water Corp is violently opposed to anyone doing this because it threatens their control of a very scarce resource. And of course, as the more water becomes a scarce resource, the more money they can demand for it. Water Corp beat up Hope and Tapiwa. They then take refuge in an underground politically as well as physically underground, in an underground cave where the water collection movement, the subversive water collection movement lives. And all they do is plan to strike back and continue to collect water for redistribution in an equitable way. So now moving on to my conclusions, and I'd like to say that there are really no particular conclusions. All four of the texts that I've discussed here have come to very similar ideas. They've all pointed fingers at multinational capitalism. Multinational capitalism is represented by real corporations such as Recon Africa, Shell, BP, as well as in imaginary corporations such as Ultimate Corp and Water Corp. All four of the texts have also mentioned habitat destruction, species loss, and the need for climate justice and a just energy transition, which I must say is desperately, urgently needed at this stage. And finally, all four of them depict vulnerabilities as being differential and as being intersectionally constituted. This brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm going to show off my knowledge of South African languages by saying thank you to you in several different languages. Ngiyabonga, kia leboga, baie dankie, enkosi, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Byrne. And we have questions from the audience. So Roy has raised his hand. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Byrne. It was indeed an amazing presentation. I just wanted to throw in two instances of response from Indian multinational capitalism in particular to the climate situation in South Africa. First one is where a construction material called the mud brick or adobe is being marketed in India, South India, specifically as something that can withstand even the conditions in South Africa. So where the mud brick is being marketed as a material that can withstand even the unfavorable conditions in South Africa. So where you're using somebody else's, let's say, climate vulnerability as a means to market a product. And the second instance, which I feel is even more serious, it happened just 1 week or so ago, when the government of Namibia declared their decision to kill hundreds of animals, ungulates, large animals, zebras, hippos, elephants, etc. It was an effort to somehow resist against the largest drought Namibia has seen in this century. So, two ways in which they intend to do this is, one is meat for the starving people, and the second one to prevent human-animal conflicts during the time of drought. So the Indian multinational corporation called Vantara Foundation, which is owned by Anant Ambani, the son of the richest person in India. This foundation, it did provide some monetary support to Namibia, but it also expressed concern over killing animals. It in a very shallow way by ignoring the bigger picture of what's going on in Namibia, how the people are starving, and the drought, etc. So, these two rather insensitive responses in terms of multinational capitalism, and please note that this isn't coming from the global north; it's coming from India. So I was wondering how they serve to complicate or elucidate the discourse that you have so efficiently put forth.
Thank you so much for those questions. I was not aware of Indian intervention in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think it's very unfortunate, actually. But maybe it's simply an example of countries in the global south kind of getting on the bandwagon in a way of making money at the expense of other people's vulnerabilities. I'm particularly horrified about the Namibian government's decision to cull hundreds of animals in the country. Yeah. No words. Sorry. Thank you very much. I do think it complicates and costs nuance over my analysis, and perhaps it's not all the global north's fault.
Thank you.
Perhaps it's the fault of patriarchal capitalism and human exceptionalism.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Hope, please go ahead. Gerard Hope has a question.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Prof. Byrne. Let me just move to the other screen so that you don't stare at the side of my face. Apologies. Prof. Byrne, thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. I just want to ask, do you think that the climate crisis in Africa gives the Global South an opportunity in the sense that it can harness technologies that have been developed in the Global North to solve African problems?
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, do you want me to repeat the...
Yes, please.
Sorry. I was just commenting that the current climate crisis also presents Africa and the Global South a particular opportunity in that it can harness technologies that have been already perfected in the Global North to tackle climate issues. But that also points to issues of political will and private investment. And it all points back to capitalism, I assume, in the end.
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, NUA, for example, in NUA, Okorafor uses technological enhancements which I think have been developed in the global north, such as wireless internet. Okay. She has wireless internet transferring energy from the red eye to from the solar farms to other areas in Nigeria. And she also draws on this vast cloud of AI, which was, of course, we know that from OpenAI and ChatGPT and all the other things that bedevil us, and also supposedly make our lives easier and make everybody else's life easier. But also, once AO can access the pomegranate and the massive amount of information in AI, she then becomes not only a savior, but a target, because Ultimate Corp obviously wants to harness her for their own ends. And yes, well, the rest is a question. But I think it does provide an opportunity. It's just that, as Temperature Rising explains, the Global South should guard against exploitation, ultimately.
Yes.
And we need to guard more against exploitation, because part of the reason why companies like Recon Africa and Shell are targeting the so-called underdeveloped countries in Africa is that there are fewer restrictions on what is euphemistically called development in Africa than they are in their own countries.
Sure, definitely. Prof. Byrne, what's also happening now is that apart from the fossil fuel companies that you mentioned, exploiting the global south. There's renewable energy companies as well that are also jumping onto the bandwagon as well, wanting to foist their technology onto Africa, and it doesn't really work in all contexts as well. So it's very important for Africa to adapt technology to its own needs and requirements.
If only we made the decisions, eh?
Yeah, we would get much higher salaries then as well.
We definitely would.
Thanks, Prof. Byrne.
Thank you so much.
Sinead Mason has a question. Yes, Mr. Mason, please go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Prof. Byrne, for such a interesting and very insightful talk. There's lots of different texts that I'm very interested in looking at, particularly with climate fiction. What I was thinking about while you were talking is it's almost like a new genre of fiction that it seems to have opened up with climate fiction. And like you mentioned in the beginning, that a lot of that, for instance, the book you were talking about, It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, is part of speculative fiction. But I was wondering if you had noticed in your research any sort of ways of using language and form, particularly in climate change fiction, that was particular to this particular genre, and not only talking about the intersectionality of the people in the books, but how the language is used that is particular to climate change, and if you had any ideas of what that could mean.
I think what is particular to climate fiction, which is known as cli-fi, which tends to be speculative fiction. So it tends to be to depict possible futures and tends to speculate or extrapolate on present conditions. What I notice most is a predominance of dystopian images of the landscape, so that would be on a rather negative side. But on a more positive side, they uniformly insist on the interdependence of human and what we call non-human, or what can also be called more than human forces. So humans can no longer see themselves as being separate from the so-called natural world. Humans have to see themselves as entangled in a web of interdependencies. Those, I think, are the two things that I see. But I also see a stress in African climate fiction on the so-called oppressed, the underdog, as it were. So the people who identify most with environmental causes tend to be women, or tend to be people who are in other ways oppressed or vulnerable. I don't know if that's answered your question. I don't think I've really noticed any particular uses of, say, metaphor, simile, tone, or anything of that nature. But should I come across any, I certainly will let you know.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a good talk.
Gerard Hope has a question. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Byrne. Sorry, I just want to comment on that. Cli-fi as subgenre of speculative fiction. It also becomes interesting when it intersects with Afrofuturism as well, which is a different subgenre. And it's also dystopian, but it's got separate concerns and aesthetics as well.
Well, yes. I don't think Afrofuture. Yeah, the relationships between genres and subgenres are so complicated that they go into a Gordian knot. So Afrofuturism and then, of course, African futurism, let's not forget that, they sort of intersect something like this with climate fiction in Africa. So not all African climate fiction is African futurism or Afrofuturism, and vice versa as well. But they also have very particular strategies, which I think one of the strategies that I notice in Afrofuturism is a decolonization of the genre. So moving away from literary tropes and metaphors that are common in fiction from the global north and from the west, and moving towards indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous ways of making sense, which are also present in the stories that I mentioned as well. So, for example, at the end of It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, Lutando mentions that he's gathering stories, and which harkens back to the storytelling tradition in Africa, oral storytelling tradition. And it's an alternative way of working with knowledge.
Okay, that's interesting as well. I think that cli-fi as a subgenre is one of the older and more established subgenres of speculative fiction. It's quite strange. I mean, you can take it all the way back to Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, or The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard, and more recently, Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. I think that's also cli-fi. So it's quite a diverse subgenre.
It's just one that's become much more prominent in the internet.
Yeah, it's also become highly politicized as well as speculative fiction. I'm thinking here of writers like Kim Stanley Robinson, who have very specific social democratic agendas in their fiction, to promote the aims of the global north.
Indeed.
Great.
Well, I mean, I think that's another thing I was trying to say in my talk, is that all of these environmental causes are intertwined with political goals, political ends, and political justice. So, for example, Gabriel Clausen's fight against coal use in South Africa is highly politicized because you know why.
Yeah. Okay. Politics. Thanks.
If there are no more questions, perhaps we could move on to a formal vote of thanks by Professor Pramod Nair, the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was a major exposition of the fiction. I was particularly interested in the conversation with Sinead and Gerald Hope, looking at genres, the hard sci-fi of Kim Stanley Robinson, though it's a moot point why he cannot write anything less than 400 pages long. It's like reading Stephen Baxter and Kim Stanley Robinson back to back would be good enough for a life sentence. But I thought the genres of cli-fi, McKay's work, and the responses, especially references to Octavia Butler and others, were very interesting. And I hope those of the students who are here, who are looking forward to looking at researching this area, will have much to take away from your talk. Thank you also for embedding it in contexts that are crucial. And I would like to thank in particular Roy Matthew for drawing attention to the socio-political circumstance of the culling of animals that has made headlines actually in India. It's been splashed across our news media about this. And the human-animal conflict that this entails, and the kind of environmentalism of the poor or environmentalism of the global south that this engenders. Extremely illuminating, and I'm very thankful to you for finding the time to do this. To all the other people who responded to this talk, for attending, and to Atul particularly for emceeing. Thank you all, and to remind you, the recording of this will be up early December on the UNESCO Chair's website. Thank you all, and see you again soon at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.